Senator Rubio, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you.
Good to be here in South Carolina.
Great to be here.
Let's start with one of your rivals here. Has Donald Trump been good for the Republican Party and his candidacy?
Well, obviously, I don't agree with everything he says. There's a lot that we have a difference of opinion on, but we can't ignore that he's touched on some issues that people are concerned about. If you look at the statements he made this week, obviously, I think he made them partially to recapture the limelight after having lost it. And I do think we lost some of the focus on the attacks in San Bernardino and focused on a plan that isn't really a plan and is never going to happen. But he is reminding us in that process that people are really upset and they're really scared, they're worried. And I think the president made things worse last Sunday with his speech, not better. And you know, that's what he's focused in on.
You called his comments offensive and outlandish. That's a lot different than the tone you just took with me right now.
Well, it's offensive and outlandish in the sense that, for example, it's not going to happen, number one. I think it violates a lot of the things that we think about our country, but also the practical reality that in order for us to identify homegrown violent extremism and prevent it or root it out before it takes action, we were going to need the cooperation of Muslim communities in this country. They may very well be the first ones to see it. They're the ones that are going to see radicalization happening at a mosque or hear it in the community or even among their own family members. And so, and the other part is that there's a narrative that ISIS and other jihadists pose that this is a war between Muslims and the rest of the world, and that sort of victimization narrative is something we shouldn't contribute to. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that there is a radical element in Islam, jihadism, that needs to be called by name and needs to be confronted.
It is, about 3 months ago, you were asked whether Donald Trump was qualified to be president. And you said so far you hadn't heard anything to make him qualified, but that you'll give it time. Where are you today, 3 months later?
Well, the most important thing a president will be is commander-in-chief, and that requires having an understanding of the complex issues on foreign policy. Foreign policy presents us often with hard choices, not black or white choices. Oftentimes your choices are down to two less than ideal outcomes, but you got to choose which one is the best one for the country. I personally believe he continues to struggle to articulate that.
So that makes him unqualified to be
Well,
commander-in-chief?
as of now, obviously, I think I'm the most qualified. That's
I'm
why
sorry,
I'm running.
most qualified. Is he qualified at all to be commander-in-chief?
Well, again, I just have very strong reservations about what he's expressed up to this point about his understanding on some of these critical issues before our country. He still has another month before the Iowa caucus, so we'll see if he does it. But so far, I don't think. Well, he hasn't done it so far, but he's not alone. I think others in the field have confused us as well in terms of where they stand on some of these issues.
You just said that you thought the president's speech made it worse. If you were president in a moment like that, what would you have done? What would you have said?
Well, I first would have
to the
acknowledged.
country?
Well, first I would have acknowledged why people are concerned, and I would have acknowledged that we are.
He acknowledged it.
But beyond just acknowledging it in the way he did, I would have honestly said, look, I know people that are, I personally know people that have told me they're not taking trips this New Year's because they're afraid of what they're reading in the press, people that have always taken a trip at the end of the year. So this, perhaps it's anecdotal, but I think it's happening, and I hear it from people all the time. The second thing I would have pointed to is that this is a real risk. I mean, these people we're facing are not the JV team. It seems like the president has always been one step behind the problem. This is a very significant, growing, calculating, and quite frankly, increasingly capable group of people that have a sophisticated understanding of our immigration system, that have sophisticated propaganda machinery, and they're going to have to be confronted, and it will not be easy. But then I would have ended by saying, but we can defeat them. What we're doing now is not enough. Here's what we're going to do in addition to it. And I honestly believe that, yes, we need more airstrikes. You can't just defeat them from the air. You must do two additional things that we are not doing now. Number one is put together a global coalition on the ground, made up primarily of Arab Sunnis. Obviously, we'll work with the Kurds in the Kurdish areas and even with Christians to protect their cities and their families. But ISIS needs to be defeated on the ground and rejected ideologically by Sunni Arabs themselves. And it will require embedding alongside them special operators from the U.S. and other international partners. And the second is we need to start cross-messaging these people, counter-messaging them. You know, propaganda has always played a role in every war and every conflict. And this is critical here because ISIS is portraying themselves as this extraordinary caliphate that life is glorious under ISIS rule. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so we need to invest more time, for example, explaining to people what happens to non-Iraqis that join ISIS. They're treated as cannon fodder.
Everything you just outlined, though, the administration would argue that's all part of their strategy. It sounds like you basically agree with the president's strategy. You might just implement some parts of it differently.
I don't agree that's part of their strategy. Maybe rhetorically some of it is, but most of it is not. For example,
we have a propaganda program that, frankly, outsiders have said hasn't worked. And maybe
Well,
government can't be behind it.
I don't believe that we have.
You think government can
I don't think a
properly
couple of Twitter
do an
feeds-
anti-propaganda
Well, I don't think a
program?
couple of Twitter posts from the State Department is a true
Would you
anti-ISIS
model after
propaganda.
Radio Marti? I mean, you and I
Well,
are familiar with it.
absolutely, but it would also require us to work with Muslim communities around the world that are not Islamists to counter message to young people, to counter message to them about why this is not true Islam, as these Muslim leaders argue, and in fact, what life under ISIS control is like, much more widespread than what we're doing now. And on the ground, I do not believe that the president is doing what I'm outlining. There is no...
There's 68 countries
well, they're not
in a coalition.
Well, listen, I mean, there's 3 or 4 countries that are providing military force, and the rest are signed on paper, but are not contributing significantly to the cause. The truth is, the most important countries that need to be contributing, including men on the ground to fight, Egypt, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, other Gulf kingdoms, are not. Part of it is because Yemen, they're concerned about Yemen, but part of it is, quite frankly, because 2 things. They don't trust this president. They don't think he's seriously committed to this. He doesn't have a strategy. They don't think he's committed to the removal of Assad, which is critical to their participation in all of this. And also, quite frankly, because this deal with Iran has left them feeling betrayed. They feel as if the president has empowered their mortal rivals in Tehran, the Shia government there.
So because Shia wants to get rid of ISIS too. Shia Arabs want to get rid of ISIS as much as Sunni Arabs. Sunni Arab states want to get rid. Would you rule out working with the Iranians on this?
Let's talk about not just Shia Arabs. The Iranian Shia government wants to defeat ISIS, but for purposes of instituting their version of a global caliphate, their version of an apocalyptic interpretation of Islam. So in essence, there's no real way to work with them, especially since the Shia militias they are empowering on the ground in Syria have and in Iraq, I should say, are openly talking about how they intend to shoot and kill Americans if they find any on the ground. So I think it's almost impossible to work with any Shia militia sponsored by Iran.
Would you work with the Russians?
Well, it depends what Vladimir Putin is trying to do. If Vladimir Putin is sincerely interested in the defeat of ISIS and in a transition in Syria, that's one thing. I'm not convinced that he is. I think he wants to keep Assad or an Assad-like leader in power. Second, I think his biggest interest in his involvement in Syria, beyond the retention of the air base he's now established and the naval presence that they have there, is to be seen as a great global power on par with the United States. For him, it's a lot more symbolic in that sense. And so I think it's very difficult to work with him as long as that is what's motivating his involvement in this conflict.
You said that one of the reasons you feel as if some of the Sunni Arab nations are not contributing is because of the Assad sticking point.
Correct.
So as president, you would not just rhetorically call for Assad's removal, would you actively work to make that happen in order to get their cooperation?
And I've argued that since 2012. And my argument then is important to remember that the uprising against Assad, we didn't start the uprising. It was Syrians themselves, Sunnis primarily. And the presence of Assad and his treatment of Sunnis is the irritant that created a space for ISIS to come in. ISIS is primarily run by Iraqis, not by Syrians. They took advantage of the vacuum that was left behind. And my argument back then is we need to identify secular, non-Islamists, some were army defectors from the Syrian government itself, who we could empower not just to remove Assad, but to replace him with a stable government that would not leave behind this sort of vacuum that's being created as a result of the civil war. But as long as Bashar al-Assad is in power in Syria, there will either be ISIS or a group like ISIS taking advantage of the discontent of the Sunni populations in Syria against the government in Damascus.
You used a phrase, you've used the phrase class of civilizations. President Bush went out of his way to say, don't call it a class of civilizations back post 9/11. Do you regret that phrase? Because just now you've been arguing that this isn't that, but then that phrase strikes me as counter to what you've been telling me.
Because I think if you interpret that phrase as meaning we're at war with Islam and all Muslims, that's not what I'm saying, and it's ridiculous.
That's what ISIS might grab from you.
Well,
they might take your phrase and say, aha, see, the Americans, they want a class of civilizations too. They may warp your
Well, they're
words.
going to warp anything we say, but the point is, what our point is, it is a clash between ISIS, their apocalyptic vision of the future, and what they're promising this global caliphate in which everyone must either agree with their theology or die, and the rest of the world, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, and even secular people around the planet who refuse to live under those rules. It is a war between us, the peace-loving, freedom-loving people of this planet, and this radical ideology that has taken root in not just in the presence of ISIS, but also Al-Qaeda and other groups in the region. And it is a clash between them and us, because at the core here is not just the apocalyptic vision of the future that motivates them to act. I mean, they're telling people, they're recruiting them for this final Armageddon-style showdown in the city of Dabiq in Syria, but they also hate us because, for example, in America, women drive cars, and little girls go to school, and they consider those sorts of things heretical as well. So it is a clash of civilizations between radical Islamists and the rest of the world.
Are we going to have a duty? Let's say, President Rubio, you're successfully get rid of Assad. There's a transition government, but it's shaky. We've seen it's shaky in Iraq. Obviously, Libya hasn't even been able to be stood up. Isn't it going to take nation building of some sort by the United States to keep some stability
That's
there?
a term that's thrown around loosely. It didn't take nation building in Libya. There existed people in Libya that were ready to take hold there. The problem in Libya was twofold. Number one, the civil war lasted far too long. We didn't start the civil war in Libya either. The Libyan people did. And my argument back then was, if this becomes a protracted civil war, not only are people going to get killed, but militias are going to rise up, and it's going to be very difficult to disarm them and disband them after the fact, and therefore very hard for there to be a stable government. And without a stable government, you're going to leave a vacuum, and it's going to be filled by jihadists. And this administration did very little, along with the international community, did very little after Gaddafi was removed to help the people that were there in Libya to help themselves establish a firm government, not a nation building, but a government that can govern space and provide basic services.
That was, some argue that was the mistake in Iraq.
Well, there was a lot of
disbanded,
mistakes
but
in Iraq.
totally,
The
de-Baathification
was, I think, in hindsight, was clearly problematic. And in fact, what's interesting is a lot of those former Ba'ath Party officials, army generals and so forth, are providing the military guidance and expertise to ISIS today. So if you look back at history, what happened in Japan, MacArthur had to choose whether to indict or try the emperor for war crimes or not, and he made a pragmatic recommendation that if you get rid of the emperor, what will hold the country together, the loss of civil servants that may have been identified with Saddam Hussein's party, robbed Iraq of people that knew how to govern.
So Assad has to go, but it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong here, you probably would be okay with keeping Assad's government in place in some form just to keep the stability.
Well, again, it can't be someone who's guilty of war crimes and has their hands soaked in blood, but it has to be someone that can govern a country that's made up of Alawis.
You probably would keep the structure.
Well, it has to be something that can govern the country that we would support. And it won't be easy. I'm not telling you Syria is going to turn into Australia or Canada. It will be a less than ideal setting in comparison to other developed countries, but I will say this, it can't be a vacuum. And it has to be a government that is capable of finding some level of unity, if it's still possible to have a Syrian identity in the aftermath of this, but that somehow allows for governance sharing between Sunnis, Shia, and Alawis.
You have been pretty critical, your campaign has been pretty critical of one of your rivals, Senator Ted Cruz, for his vote on the USA Freedom Act. And Senator Mike Lee of Utah, somebody that you have a tax plan with, you guys are certainly allies on a lot of things. He has said that your rhetoric has been not based in fact, and that it is not true what you've been saying, that somehow federal officials can't track, use the USA Freedom Act, use the courts to track the phone numbers that are necessary.
Well, on this issue, not only is he wrong, but others that argue that are wrong. We had a program that allowed us to collect the phone records, basically the phone bill, not the content of your conversations or your emails or anything like that, just your phone bill of every American, and it was stored. Only 16 people in the US government could look at it, and they could only look at it if they got a court order from the privacy court, from a FISA court, to go in and look at those phone records. And they retained them for a significant period of time. Under this new law, we are trusting the phone companies to hold those records. And all of these phone companies have different periods of time when they hold it. Some will hold it for 18 months, some will hold it for 6 months. This is a valuable tool. If in fact you have identified someone as a potential terrorist, or if in fact someone carries out a terrorist activity, the ability to look at who they've been calling and who they've been talking to is part of a larger puzzle that you can put together to see what network they've been working with, who they've been communicating with. We have now lost that capacity in many cases, because now the records we already have in our possession are going to be destroyed, and moving forward those records will not exist. And so you won't have a full picture of who these people have been working with and who they've been talking to over an extended period of time. And as a result, we have lost a valuable tool in a larger toolbox. And we're not at a time now where we need to be taking intelligence tools away. We need to be adding additional intelligence tools. This issue of encryption is one we're really going to grapple with.
So is this a commander-in-chief test for Senator Cruz?
I believe it is for all the candidates. You know, in the case of Senator Cruz, my argument is it wasn't just the intelligence vote. I mean, he talks tough on some of these issues. For example, he's going to carpet bomb ISIS, but the only budget he's ever voted for in his time in the Senate is a budget that cut defense spending. By more than Barack Obama proposes, we cut it. He voted against the Defense Authorization Act every year that it came up. And that is the bill, and I assume that if he voted against it, he would veto it as president. Well, that's the bill that funds our troops, even the Iron Dome for Israel. So I guess my point is, each time he's had to choose between strong national defense and some of the isolationist tendencies in American politics, he seems to side with the isolationists. And this is an important issue to have a debate over. It's not personal.
Let's go to domestic here. Your campaign has been very excited about all the coverage that's been given to your successful amendment that has gotten rid of the risk corridor feature of the president's health care plan. And without getting too much into the weeds here for our viewers, essentially a way where the government would provide in the first 3 years of Obamacare an ability to, if the premium setting didn't work, the government would subsidize them for losses up to a 3-year period. You wanted to get rid of that. You called it a bailout. Why not give it the 3 years to get it off the ground? This is something the government has done for years with the space program, with all sorts of things.
Well, this is not the space program. This is a law implemented by Barack Obama to involve the federal government in health care coverage in America. Second, why should the American taxpayers be bailing out private insurance companies who lose money on an ill-designed
You know, those
plan?
same American taxpayers, based on this, could see higher premium.
Well, again, then if the plans
So
are
you're
not...
hitting them in the pocket somewhere.
No, the American taxpayer should not be spending $2.5 billion to bail out a private insurance company. And if they're not sustainable in the first year, they won't be sustainable in the fifth. Second, it's a broken promise. We were told that it wouldn't cost any taxpayer money. We were told that the fees the companies themselves were paying into the fund would fully fund any losses. And so we said, fine, let's just make it very specific that no taxpayer money could be used for it. As it turns out, only the fees they paid only came up with 13 or 14% of the money they needed to cover the losses.
How are you going to implement your health care plan? One part of it, you said you're going to reform insurance regulations, lower costs, encourage innovation, and protect the vulnerable. Those with pre-existing conditions should have access to affordable health care through mechanisms such as federally supported, actuarially sound, and state-based high-risk pools.
Yes.
All right. How do you do that without risk corridors?
Well, you don't need to do that with the risk corridors because that is a very specific element. That is not an overall plan. That is specifically designed for people basically as a safety net program. An individual who's come across hard times and is facing circumstances where because of their health conditions, they cannot find coverage in the private market.
This will be a permanent federal.
Yeah, a high risk pool for people that are
subsidy.
uninsurable basically because they suffer from a condition that is chronic and no insurance company would touch them. I've always argued that there's a role for a federal safety net. It's limited to those people, but it's a safety net program.
But this was a
but
limited,
that's a proper
but this was a
function of government.
3-year risk corridor. This wasn't even,
But it
Medicare Part
involves-
D is in
But
perpetuity.
no, but it involves the transfer of taxpayer dollars, $2.5 billion, into the hands of private companies who chose to participate in an exchange that is doomed to fail because of the profile of people that are signing up for it. Our approach is a lot better. It would allow every American to be in charge of their own health care spending. Every American would either be able to get tax-free health care money from their employer or a refundable tax credit and use it to purchase health insurance from any company in America that will sell it to them. The risk corridor is $2.5 billion of American taxpayer money that is being transferred to private insurance companies who agree to participate in Obamacare exchanges and then lose money.
You've seen what's happened, though. You've pulled the plug on this, and now there are fewer insurance companies, which means less competition, which means higher premiums. How has this been good for the American taxpayer?
But that's not as directly, that's a result of the fact that the Obamacare exchanges don't work, as we argued they wouldn't. We argued the Obamacare exchanges wouldn't work.
How do we know this doesn't work yet?
Because you're seeing it every year.
What's the definition of not working? Healthcare spending has gone down so far.
Well, this year it's starting to go up again.
Okay, we have more people are covered. I mean, what's the definition of not working?
Well,
It's not been a job killer if you just define it by the unemployment rate.
It has been a job killer in the sense that the higher paying jobs are not being created. If you look at wage growth in America, it remains very flat in comparison to where we need to be. It's not just enough to create seasonal jobs or $9 an hour jobs. You've got to create jobs that pay more. And those jobs are not being created because you have a healthcare law, particularly in the small business sector. Maybe you only have 80 employees, but that triggers these mandates that put you at a disadvantage versus a larger company. And on the issue of why it's not working, look at the profile of people that have signed up for the exchanges. They are people, number one, that once they sign up are realizing they have very high costs, high deductibles, high co-payments, and very limited provider networks. So to the extent there was a lowering in healthcare costs, part of it was due to an economic downturn, but a lot of it was due to constriction in use. In essence, people were limited in their coverage. It made it harder to access the care.
But hasn't that been part of the problem in rising healthcare costs, is that there's been this sense that people overuse the healthcare system?
No, part of it is that people don't have access, for example, to specialists in some of these plans. The nearest specialist might be 200 miles away, because in order to even make the cost near break even, you have to really limit the provider pool of services that you offer. And so one of the ways you can avoid people having care is to provide a provider network, hospitals, doctors that are hard to access. And again, despite all of that, we get calls in my office from people that are on the exchanges who are getting a bill in the mail, and they're asking, well, why am I getting a bill? And the answer is because your deductible is $5,000. Right. You've got to come up with that money out of pocket before you can even begin to use the health care law that you thought was covering you. It's just, I'm not arguing we need to go back to the old system. There were problems with the old system as well. I'm arguing that Obamacare, as constructed, has actually made things worse for most people, not better.
All right. You don't like the federal subsidy, bailout, however you want to define it when it comes to that. How can you defend sugar subsidies?
There is no such thing as a sugar subsidy. It's a sugar program, and by law, it's a zero-cost program.
If you create a floor and and the federal government is guaranteeing a floor for the price of sugar, that's a subsidy.
But the problem, what people don't understand, is that by law and by statute, it has to be a zero-cost program. By law, it is required to be zero cost. And for most of the last 10 years, it has been zero cost. There's been some
not zero cost to the consumer.
Well, again, that's not
when
accurate
sugar's
either.
2.5 times what the world market
No,
would be.
the sugar price today is the same as it was in the early 80s. And the second point that we need to argue...
But if we had global competition, the price of sugar would
There won't be global competition, because what will happen is if the American sugar industry is wiped out, because, for example, the Brazilians heavily subsidize theirs, once we are out of the picture, the Brazilians now hold a disproportionate share of the sugar industry, and at that point, they can charge whatever they want for that commodity.
There's other ways to make sugar in this country.
Well,
there's beet sugar.
Well, beet sugar is covered in all this.
There's
part of the
plenty
process.
No, but there's sugar to be covered here.
No, but this is not just a cane sugar program.
All right, but how is this
It covers
not,
beet sugar too.
I understand, but how shouldn't we cynically not look at this as you being good to a donor?
It's not it's more than just a donor. These are people that have 14,000, 15,000 jobs in the state of Florida.
Right.
But second point is, I'm prepared to get rid of the program. My argument has been that let's work out a deal where the other countries get rid of their program and we'll get rid of ours, and they compete on an even playing field. What I know will happen if we get rid of the program is what's already happening with Mexico. They're dumping sugar on the U.S. market. What's happening with Brazil? They heavily subsidize their industry. Once our agricultural base is no longer part of the global mix.
This could be just, isn't this
no, it's
the
dumping.
market? How is this not free market?
And it's not free market, it's dumping. I mean, Mexico is deliberately subsidizing the cost of their sugar to dump it into our marketplace because they're allowed to a certain amount of import because of NAFTA. In the Brazilian case, they heavily subsidize their industry. And so what will happen, they have an unfair competitive advantage over our growers. Once our growers are put out of business, that sugar land becomes developed into real estate. They now control the sugar market. And then, since they have no real competition, they can charge whatever they want for sugar and the price will go up.
Well, the idea that we're not going to have places in this country to grow sugar, you're not running for the U.S. Senate in Florida anymore. And the argument's been, you've been doing right by your constituents in the state of Florida. At what point you're running for president of the United States? What's the best policy for the country?
But it is, because it's not just sugar in Florida. There's sugar cane grown in other states and sugar beets grown in other states as well.
They're not going to get paved over and developed everywhere.
Well, in many cases, once a land can no longer be used for agriculture, its highest and best use is for either commercial or real estate development. It's not going to sit there vacant. It's going to be turned into something. I've seen it over and over again. It's happened extensively where I live in South Dade. Parcels of land that no longer were, for example, were cost effective to grow ornamentals or tomatoes have been developed. And big developers come in, they buy acres and acres of land, and they build housing on it. And once that happens, you can't come back 10 years later and turn it back into farmland. And so agriculture is a unique industry. It is site-specific. You can't just move a farm from Iowa to California, or the middle of Nevada. And secondly, it doesn't really have fair competition because virtually every country in the world tries to subsidize their agriculture industry to give them a competitive advantage. But let me be clear. If other countries get rid of theirs, I'm ready to get rid of ours. I'll be the first person to stand up and say, there's a free trade agreement now, let's get rid of it. Or they've gotten rid of their program, we'll get rid of ours. I'm prepared to compete head on, but I'm not going to let Brazil wipe out our agriculture sector.
This subsidy does technically cost the American consumer.
No, it doesn't.
2.5 times.
It will cost the American consumer more if we allow Brazil to dominate the global sugar market, because then they'll have no competition and they can charge whatever they really want for that commodity.
There's been some questions on some of even your supporters and people that are pulling for you and that say, where's Rubio going to win? He's not playing to win Iowa. He's not playing to win New Hampshire. And at some point, Donald Trump aside, you got to win if you're going to win the nomination.
Look, we'll all be judged at the end of this race. So if at the end of this race things don't work out, then obviously we'll be subject to criticism. Let's wait and see how the votes are counted. I feel very confident in our plan. To be honest,
Are you trying to win Iowa?
I'm trying to do well and win everywhere we campaign. I'm not running for second, third place in any state in this country. Obviously, these races are very different. I'm trying to win everywhere that we campaign. I always strive for first place. That doesn't always work out that way. And in many of these elections, a strong second place is viewed as a first place, but you can't campaign to finish second or third. You work to win as many votes as you can and see how it plays out. But the truth is, I'm a candidate running for president. I'm not trying to win Campaign Manager of the Year award. So I'll allow the people that run our campaign to figure out the logistics, and I trust we have a very good plan and it's very well funded. We're going to continue to focus on the issues before America, because ultimately what we're electing is the next president of the United States, not a political strategist.
You are now viewed as the establishment favorite. How do you handle the word establishment?
Well, I know that it's meant as a slight, and quite frankly, I've had my share of
do
run-ins.
you feel like
with
that
what-
is an attack?
Well,
when
look,
people
I
say
mean, I don't
establishment?
think it accurately reflects my history. I mean, I wouldn't be in the Senate. The establishment didn't want me in the United States Senate. I have consistently voted against many of the things that some people who you would identify as the establishment are for. When I chose to get into this race, I had a lot of people come forward and tell me I shouldn't run, that it wasn't my turn. And by the way, if I was the establishment favorite, I would have raised a lot more than $6 million in the last quarter. That all being said, the truth is we ultimately will need to unify this party. The Republican Party cannot be elected unless it is together, working together in the same direction. And that alone is not enough. We can't win without unifying our party, but we can't just win by unifying our party. We must also attract new people to our cause. And we do that not by changing our principles, but by applying our principles of limited government, free enterprise, and a strong national defense to the hopes and dreams and concerns of everyday Americans, some of whom have not heard from Republicans in a very long time.
Very quickly, two other topics. I don't know if you caught Justice Scalia's remarks during the affirmative action argument, and in making a case, in questioning one of the people arguing before the court. He was talking about affirmative action. He said, some African Americans, and he said, that they're being led into Texas and they should be in lesser schools. And it was a comment that I think that many African Americans took as offensive. Did you catch the comment?
I didn't read, I saw a headline somewhere. I didn't read the depth of the comments. Suffice it to say that throughout my career, I don't think there's anything wrong with any institution making a concerted effort to be more attractive to minority candidates, Hispanics, African Americans, women, although women are not a minority, obviously, but they are a group that has been disproportionately not reflected in higher education for decades in terms of upward mobility in certain job fields. I don't think there's anything wrong with affirmatively trying to attract people. I've never supported quotas. I don't think quota system is appropriate.
But if the University of Texas wants to make sure 10% of its admissions is African American, is there anything wrong with that?
Well, I think the only problem with that is, obviously, on the one hand, I think it is good to say that should be our goal, that we want to see us have more outreach to communities and ensure that we can get more people in that reflect our state and reflect our population. The flip side of it is, if a qualified student who may not fit their profile is not admitted as a result of a quota, that's unfair. So I think the best way forward is just to provide opportunities for all people to be able, and I think there's a lot of impediments to things like higher education in the 21st century. A lot of it has to do with costs or availability. You have a large number of Americans that are non-traditional students, a disproportionate number of whom are single women raising children or minorities who cannot go back to school or go to school because they have to work full-time and raise a family. And the current traditional higher education system is not cost or time effective for them. And it's why I've worked so hard in a bipartisan fashion to find alternatives to traditional higher education.
And finally, in an interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, you said this: when there's a conflict between government and your faith, you said, God's rules always win. And let me read your quote even further. If we are ever ordered by a government authority to personally violate and sin, violate God's law and sin, if we're ordered to stop preaching the gospel, if we are ordered to perform a same-sex marriage as someone presiding over it, we are called to ignore that. And then you said it should be peacefully done if you want to fight for that. But that line between God and the Constitution, where is it for you?
Well, one thing is societal behavior and the other is an individual. No individual in America should ever be compelled to sin. No individual in America should be forced to violate the tenets of their faith. And so what Christianity teaches is that if the government compels you to personally sin, for you to do it, that you shouldn't, that if it comes down to that conflict. But it also teaches that as long as you live in a society where you can affect the laws, you should work through that process to change it. So the specific case would be a minister who somehow is being compelled to perform a same-sex marriage. That person should not be forced to do that. But it also means that for the rest of us on a broader scale who disagree, for example, with the Supreme Court decision, as long as we live in this constitutional republic, we have an opportunity to work to change any law that we don't agree with, and we should continue to work through that process. And it was an issue about civil disobedience, was the root of the question.
Yes.
And I always point back to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he was being challenged by a group of white pastors about why was he conducting civil disobedience. And his argument was, I tried to work through the process that we have in this country, but African Americans are not allowed to vote, and we're consistently being ignored, and it has left us no choice but to stand for the tenets of our faith, the equality of all men, by civil disobedience. But if there is an opportunity to work through our republic to make changes on laws we don't agree with, we are compelled to work through that in respect for our civil authorities. But on an individual, personal level, no one should ever be compelled to sin by law.
Are you going to work to overturn the same-sex marriage?
Well, I disagree with it on constitutional grounds.
But are you going to work to overturn this?
I think it's bad law, and for the following reason. If you want to change the definition of marriage, then you need to go to state legislatures and get them to change it. Because states have always defined marriage. And that's why some people get married in Las Vegas by an Elvis impersonator. Right. And in Florida, you got to wait a couple days when you get your permit. Every state has different marriage laws. But I do not believe that the court system was the right way to do it. Because I don't believe...
But it's done now. Are you going to work to overturn it?
Well, you can't work to overturn it.
Sure, you can do a constitutional amendment.
Well, as I've said, I don't believe that. That would be conceding that the current Constitution is somehow wrong and needs to be fixed. I don't think the current Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate marriage. That belongs at the state and local level. And that's why if you want to change the definition of marriage, which is what this argument is about, it's not about discrimination, it is about the definition of a very specific, traditional, and age-old institution. That definitional change, if you want to change it, you have a right to petition your state legislature and your elected representatives to do it. What is wrong is that the Supreme Court has found this hidden constitutional right that 200 years of jurisprudence had not discovered, and basically overturned the will of voters in Florida, where over 60% passed a constitutional amendment that defined marriage in the state constitution as the union of one man and one woman.
So, are you accepting the idea of same-sex marriage in perpetuity?
Well, it is current law. I don't believe any case law is settled law. Any future Supreme Court can change it. And ultimately, I will appoint Supreme Court justices that will interpret the Constitution as originally constructed.
Senator Rubio?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.